Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to chapter 8 of our Understanding International Relations lectures. We'll have a look today at Neorealism. Neorealism, which emerged at the end of the 70s, which became pretty successful in the discipline of international relations during the 80s, thanks also to the historical background, the historical context, the so-called Little Cold War, and the success of neorealism was at the origin of the so-called neo debate, opposing neorealists, at least some of them, to neoliberals or neoliberal institutionalists, in the domain of cooperation. So it's a kind of middle range debate within the discipline of international relations. We saw last week, we saw in our chapter 7, the analysis of the Cold War proposed by the English School of International Relations. According to the English school, the Cold War was a bipolar society, because of the capacity of both superpowers during at least the period of détente from roughly 62 to the mid of the 70s, the capacity of these two superpowers to have a dialogue, to agree at least implicitly upon some rules of behavior. A bipolar society because of the rivalry which nevertheless existed. The period of détente, which started after the Cuban Missile Crisis, also influenced other scholars, non-members of the English school. And that is to say, some of the then, of course, still numerous realists, who, however, had gradually been attacked by, we saw this, behaviourists, by Marxists or neo-Marxists, by transnationalists, and now by the English school. So a new generation of realists will emerge, and though being influenced by the period of détente, entente cooperation, their analysis of this period, or of the evolution of the Cold War from the power political confrontation that had been the context of the classical realists, such as Morgenthau, this new generation of realist scholars will also be influenced by the period of détente, though proposing a different analysis, distinguished from the one of the English school, for the very simple reason, of course, that realists in general, and therefore also this new generation, the neo-realists, as they were called a bit later, for realists in general, and therefore also for neo-realists, the concept of society, which is the one used by the English school, presupposes the possibility of peace, or now there can be no peace in the strict meaning of the term, according to realists, according to whom international politics is characterized by a never-ending, by an all-encompassing state of war. Wars are always likely to break out. There is disposition to go to war, and therefore there can be no peace strictly defined. And therefore they prefer the term stability or order, temporary stability, temporary order. So it's this order that prevailed in the 60s and the 70s that the neorealists will analyze, and background will permit them to propose a grand theory, a general theory, the neorealist theory, first and foremost due to Kenneth Waltz. Not necessarily in his first book, Man, the State at War, but in the second book, Theory of International Politics, somehow the Bible of neorealism. Waltz's analysis were pretty successful, as I already said at the very beginning of today's class, because of the evolution of the Cold War. That is to say, because of the so-called Little Cold War, which characterized the US-Soviet relations after the period of détente, that is to say, roughly from the end of the 70s and during the end of the 70s, the second half of the 70s and the beginning of the 80s. Little Cold War because of Soviet Union's expansionist behavior in Africa. Soviet Union became an ally of Ethiopia opposed to Somalia. The Soviet Union intervened directly or indirectly, that is, via Cuban troops in the former colonies of Portugal, in southern Africa, Mozambique, Angola notably. And last but not least, it invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. The Soviet also deployed middle-range missiles, yeah, SS-20 missiles, likely to hit the Western European territories. And this deployment provoked the outbreak of the so-called Euro missile crisis, because the Americans, of course, NATO, decided to counter-deploy their intermediate missiles, the cruise missiles, the Pershing missiles, in order to cope with this threat. So a crisis broke out, opposing the Soviets to the Americans. And last but not least, Ronald Reagan was elected American president. He did not hesitate to consider the USSR to be the evil empire. So new tensions emerged. It's the third period of tensions during the Cold War, and this little Cold War therefore offered to some extent the corroboration of the neorealist analysis of the Cold War, of the period of détente, as at best kind of temporary stability rather than a more positively defined bipolar society or a long peace. Waltz's success, ladies and gentlemen, due to this context, was rejected as usual in the discipline by non-realist scholars. And these non-realist scholars looked for some elements in Waltz's analysis to criticize him. And this criticism were put forward by notably neoliberals or neoliberal institutionalists, first and foremost Robert Keohane, who attacked Kenneth Waltz's conception of cooperation, or maybe should I say conception of impossible cooperation. In his major book, After Hegemony, we saw Keohane in chapter 6. He had been a transnationalist, and then he abandoned transnationalism to commit himself in this neo debate. His analysis of cooperation was a bit later criticized by another neo-realist, not necessarily Kenneth Waltz, who did not commit himself in the debate, but Joseph Grieco, in a short article, Anarchy and the Limits of Cooperation. So we will first have a look at Kenneth Waltz's grand theory, and then at the neo debate in the specific domain of cooperation. One general remark before going to the details regarding the question of the links between theory or theories and their emergence, their success, and the empirical reality, the context, the background, the historical context. I already said that theories do not float freely. They are embedded and therefore shaped by a specific context, both the political context, in our case, the international political context, and the academic context, that is to say, how a scientific field, how a scientific discipline works. And theories, therefore, sometimes are successful because of evolutions in the political context and in the academic setting. But sometimes theories are conceived of before being successful thanks to the context. And this precisely is the case of the neorealist approach. Kenneth Waltz proposed an analysis of the stability of the Cold War, and his analysis was successful once the little Cold War increased once again the tensions, because his idea of a temporary stability somehow was corroborated by the power political confrontation. Anyway, let's go into the details of the neo-realist grand theory of international politics. Neo-realists, ladies and gentlemen, rather than classical realists, for two reasons. The first reason, obviously, is a question of generation. Kenneth Waltz belongs to the generation that came after Morgenthau's generation. And the context changed. We saw this. The period of détente is different from the recurring crises that broke out and notably at the end of the 40s and throughout the 50s. And if we look at the academic setting, there is also an important point that should be emphasized. Neorealism is also a response to those criticisms, or at least to some of the criticisms that were raised against Morgenthau's classical realism. We saw these criticisms. First, the behaviourist criticisms, claiming that classical realists start, due to the fact that they started from the hypothesis, the assumption of an evil nature of man, explaining power politics. Behaviourists considered this starting point to be philosophical or even metaphysical. They rejected this starting point and asked and said that we should look concretely at how a state or statesman behave, rather than claiming that human nature is bad and that this explains power politics. So behaviourists criticized the philosophical underpinnings of classical realism, and we also saw that transnationalists and Marxists criticized the fact for classical realists to exclusively focus on states, to exclusively focus on the diplomatic, strategic, military domain, the political domain, while, according to them, notably, the economic domain was at least as important. So Waltz will be influenced by the behaviourist critiques. He will be influenced by the behaviourists rejecting human nature as an explanation of power politics. The Marxist and transnational critics, above all the Marxist critics, will be taken into account by another neorealist, Robert Gilpin. Robert Gilpin's approach, which we will have a look at in our chapter 11, not in our chapter 8, but in our chapter 11. Why? For the very simple reason that Gilpin's neorealism refers to or uses the power cycle theory as opposed to the balance of power theory. So it's a different kind of neorealism that I will prefer to have a look at in chapter 11, also for the reason that in today's context, the post-Cold War context, Gilpin's neorealism was somehow rediscovered and can be considered, at least is my analysis, to be pretty relevant to explain what is going on, notably between the US and China. So let's come back to Kenneth Waltz. Kenneth Waltz proposes, I would say, the original version of neorealism. And two books should be mentioned here. The first one is his PhD dissertation, Man, the State and War, published in 1959, followed by the Bible of Neorealism, A Theory of International Politics, published in 1979. So the second book, to some extent, is the logical consequence, the logical crowning of the analyses that he had proposed in Man, the State at War. So in Man, the State at War, Kenneth Waltz is interested in proposing a survey of the different theories of war and peace that had been proposed in the past from past philosophers, Thucydides, via Machiavelli, via Hobbes, etc., up to Morgenthau, the first generation of classical realists. And according to Kenneth Waltz, the different authors, philosophers, thinkers, but also more contemporary theorists, can be put into three categories. That is to say, depending on how they explain war and peace, depending on where they locate the major causes of war. Why do wars regularly break out? According to past theorists and thinkers, this is the objective of Kenneth Waltz in Man, the State and War. And according to Kenneth Waltz, the different authors of the past did locate the major causes, the fundamental causes of war, either in the nature of man, and this is what he calls the first image, or in the domestic regime of collective actors, that is to say, of states. This is the second image, or at the systemic level. And this then will be his third image. So let's very quickly sum up the three images concerned according to those authors, as read by Waltz, as interpreted by Waltz in his Man, State and War. War is due to human nature. That is to say, the major causes of war are located at the first image level of human nature. That is to say, men are considered to be bad, to be evil, to be egoistic, to be aggressive. And since states are somehow artificial men, groupings, collective groupings of individual men, they behave exactly like men. That is to say, they go to war in order to dominate. And according to Waltz, rightly so, Hobbes, of course, and Morgenthau are representative of this first image approach. Then he comes to the second image, to those theories that locate the major causes of war, that explain why wars regularly break out by looking at the domestic regime of a state, the ideologies prevailing within a society, to some extent the economic system also, since it is a domestic fact. And according to Kenneth Waltz, authors of the past who accepted this second image were both liberals and Marxists. Liberals, because we saw this when looking at the idealists of the interwar period. Idealism is a version within the broad approach called liberalism. According to liberals, autocracies, so it's a domestic regime, are likely to be war prone, while democracies are supposed to be peace-loving countries. And according to Marxists, it is the capitalist nature of an economy which explains why states having such an economy go regularly to war. So we have here domestic factors. And then Kenneth Waltz comes to the third image, the third level of analysis, the system level of analysis. And he considers that, according to some authors of the past, and first and foremost Thucydides, when analyzing the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we'll come back to him in a few minutes. These authors, according to Kenneth Waltz, ascribe the major causes of war to the systemic distribution of power resources among major states. It is the anarchical structure of international politics and the configuration of power resources among major states, which explains why wars regularly break out. Basically, it is the anarchical structure. And Kenneth Waltz, at the end of this book, agrees with this third image explanation, which he sums up by referring to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Why do wars regularly break out? You have the sentence on the slide. A war occurs because there is nothing to prevent it. That is to say, there is no authority above states preventing them from going to war when they consider it is their interest to do so. And this absence of a central authority explains better, both than human nature or than the specific characteristics of the domestic regime of the states, this anarchical structure, this absence of any authority, explains basically why wars regularly break out. So it is a third image explanation, and this explanation then will be revisited, improved, deepened in Kenneth Waltz's second book, Theory of International Politics, published 20 years after his Man, the State and War. Let's then have a look at his Theory of International Politics. Theory of International Politics is an attempt to apply the third image explanation, not merely to the explanation of why wars break out, but a general picture. He proposes a general picture, general theory of international politics. Politics, strictly defined, not international relations. He's interested in the political, strategic, military domain. He's interested in what regularly occurs on the international political scene and not in specific decisions or actions. So international politics, both distinguished from international relations, and all the more so transnational relations, of course, but also from foreign policy. Remember the different definitions that we gave of these different terms in our introductory chapter. So how then does international politics work? Kenneth Waltz's answer consists in saying that to understand international politics, regular international political outcomes, we have to refer to the three principles of international politics, the three principles constitutive of international systems, since it is at the international system that are located the major causes of how states regularly behave. And the three principles are the following one: the ordering principle, the differentiation principle, and the distribution principle. The ordering principle first, regarding the way states are structurally arranged at the international system level. And Waltz here agrees with Hadley Bull, in asserting the radical specificity of the international system, the radical difference of the international system when compared to a domestic political system. While domestic political systems are hierarchical and centralized, there is a central authority, the government. In domestic societies, no such central authority exists on the international scene. The international system, therefore, is not hierarchical, but anarchic. It is not centralized, but it is decentralized. Listen to Kenneth Waltz. The parts of domestic political systems stand in relations of super and subordination. Domestic systems are centralized and hierarchic. And now the opposite is true. For international political system, the parts of international political system, or the actors, the units of international political systems, stand in relations of coordination, not super or sub. So no hierarchy, no vertical relations, but horizontal coordination. None is entitled to command, and none is required to obey. International systems, to put it differently, are decentralized and anarchic. So this is the starting points that I mentioned at the very beginning of my lectures in the introduction. The fact for international relations to be distinguished from other social domestic political relations by the fact that they take place in an anarchical environment. Hadley Bull had emphasized this point, and Kenneth Waltz too. And here we have a very important first difference with classical realists. Remember Morgenthau, according to Morgenthau, since human nature is the explanatory factor, politics in general is power politics. Not merely international politics, but also domestic politics. It is a difference of degree, but not a difference of a kind between domestic politics and international politics. Always power is the objective pursued. Only the setting, the environment, the stage is different. Waltz, just as Bull before him, and to some extent all the mainstream scholars that will come after Bull and Waltz, agree in saying that the typical characteristic characteristic of international politics is its anarchical structure, or, to quote Waltz, its anarchical ordering principle, and therefore we have to distinguish radically international politics from domestic politics from politics. In general, the first important difference between neorealism and classical realism, I will sum up the differences after the presentation of Waltz's theory. First principle. Second principle, the differentiation principle. So all states undertake actions in an anarchical international system. The consequence, according to Kenneth Waltz, is that states are alike units. They are like units. What does that mean? This means that they all perform the same functions. We could say in more concrete terms, they all pursue the same objectives. That is to say, according to Kenneth Waltz, of course, states are different. There are powerful and less powerful states. There are wealthy states and poor states. There are states that emerged many centuries ago and more recently born states, etc., etc. So states somehow are different, but though they vary, they differ in size, in wealth, in power. These variations, I quote Waltz, are variations among like units, because the fact for them to be committed in an anarchical environment has as the very concrete consequence the fact for states that they are alike in the tasks they face. They are alike in the tasks they face. Anarchy implies sameness, that is to say, anarchy incites and somehow compels states to look for their security. States, because of the absence of any authority, and to come back to man, the state, and war, because of war may break out, since there is nobody likely to prevent wars from breaking out, states have to look for their security. Listen to Kenneth Waltz. The ends states aspire to are similar. Which ends then security? In anarchy, security is the highest end. In anarchy, security is the highest end. So here we have a second difference with Morgenthau's classical realism. Remember, according to Morgenthau, states look for power. Their national interest is defined in terms of power. According to Kenneth Waltz, he does not use the term national interest, but somehow we could do so. According to Kenneth Waltz, the international anarchical structure, the ordering principle, compels states to look for their security. What is the difference between security and power? Well, states looking for their security do not really try to impose their will upon somebody else. They just want to prevent someone else from imposing their power upon them. So it is a defensive power politics as opposed to an offensive power politics. And the second difference then between classical realists and neorealists is the following one. Since states, according to classical realists, look for power, classical realists, at least such as Morgenthau, are basically offensive realists. And since, according to Waltz, states look for security, and given that Waltz is a neorealist, the majority of neorealists would agree in saying that they are defensive realists. According to Waltz, I come back to the differentiation principle, states look for their security, and in order to do so, they have to adopt the so-called self-help principle. They can only rely upon themselves. They cannot rely or trust somebody else. Self-help is the principle of action, is necessarily the principle of action, which concretely means that states basically try to maintain or to re-establish a balance of power, to create balances of power. That is to say, to maintain their security, they prevent, they try to aim at, they try to, and they aim at preventing any other state from becoming more powerful than themselves. This is the definition of balance. A balance exists when no state is more powerful than any other state. So the politics of balance of power is the concrete substance of the self-help or unilateral principle. Balances of power, of course, are looked for, at least implicitly this is the case, by major states, by major powers, those who have enough resources to calculate if they are able or not to maintain the balance of power. Waltz comes to the third principle, the distribution principle, relative to the configuration of the international system, that is to say, relative to how the world's material power resources are distributed among the major powers. That is to say, though all the states are like units, some of them are more likely to create and to maintain and to really establish balances of power than other ones. A major system, a system then is distinguished according to the number of major powers. According to Kenneth Waltz, the great powers, but it is typical of realists in general, the great powers always are to be privileged in an analysis, a theoretical analysis of international relations. Listen to Kenneth Waltz. Students of international politics make distinctions between international systems according to the number of their great powers. The structure of a system changes with changes in the distribution of capabilities across the system. And of course, there can be either multipolar systems when there are at least 3 major powers, past centuries, and bipolar systems when there are 2 major powers. Now, in the 1970s, when he wrote his book, when he conceived this book, there were 2 major powers. The system was bipolar. The system, not the society, according to Kenneth Waltz. There is no society according to Kenneth Waltz or according to realists in general. There is a system characterized by the presence of 2 major powers possessing more resources than all the other ones, which therefore are secondary powers. Now, there were 2 major powers, and the period, I come back to the beginning of today's class, which influences Kenneth Waltz's theory, was the stability of the détente period. Kenneth Waltz does come to the conclusion that a system's stability is likely to be guaranteed when there are only 2 major powers rather than 3, 4, 5, a multipolar system. According to Kenneth Waltz, and this then is his explanation of why the Cold War did not escalate into a hot war, despite what classical realists had said, power, political confrontation, etc., sooner or later will end up in producing a war. No, stability is possible, according to Kenneth Waltz, although at least temporarily is possible thanks to the bipolar distribution of power resources regarding the distribution principle of the international system of the Cold War. Why then is bipolarity stability prone? For 3 major reasons, according to Kenneth Waltz. First, bipolarity is a simple structure. When there are only 2 major powers, by definition, the 2 major powers merely have to take care of one adversary. So, to come back to Robert Jervis, the risks of misperception are smaller. And when there are 3, 4, 5, it is difficult to know what a third, a fourth, a fifth power may do in the future. When you have to come only with 1, it is easier to know what the resources of this other one consist in, what its intentions may be, etc., etc. It is easier to deal with one adversary than with prospectively 2, 3, 4 adversaries. Will these adversaries be your ally? Will they become remain your adversary, your enemy, etc., etc.? So shifting alliances introduces an uncertainty which does not exist when there are only two superpowers. Two superpowers, to some extent, end up learning how to cope with one another. And to some extent, then the prevailing reality corroborated Waltz's analysis. You know that, or you may know that within the Western camp, de Gaulle in 1966 decided that France should no longer be part of the unified military command of NATO. But de Gaulle's decision did not weaken the US, because the majority of Western power resources were controlled, possessed by the US. And the same is true for the Soviet bloc. The USSR, China, no longer remains a loyal communist ally, roughly from the end of the 60s onward. But this did not significantly weaken the USSR, because the USSR did possess the vast majority of the power resources, the military power resources, within the Soviet camp. So the behavior of secondary powers, to put it differently, the behavior of secondary powers is somehow secondary. It is not important. Second reason why a bipolar system is stable, according to Kenneth Waltz, the two major powers are separated. They occupy two regions in the world that have no geographical proximity. There is no geographical contiguity between the Soviet and the Americans. If you look at the map, the only point of contact is somewhere between Alaska and Siberia, which is not the core of neither the US nor the USSR. So geographically, they occupy opposed sides of the planet, and there where there were indirect contacts via their allies, what did they do? Well, they established artificial barriers. The Berlin Wall, the demilitarized zone between South and North Korea, which is still existing nowadays. Geographically separated, economically they were separated too. There was no significant trade between the capitalist economy of the Western countries and the socialist command economy of the USSR and its allies. And psychologically, last kind of separation. Psychologically, there were no contacts between the Eastern and the Western peoples. You know that the citizens of communist countries could not travel freely in the world, and according to realists, this prevented somehow nationalist or jingoistic mentalities to aggravate the political rivalry between East and West. Cold-blooded diplomats were able to manage the relation without any impact of public opinions. Remember that according to realists, average citizens are not aware of what international politics really consists. And third explanation of why, according to Kenneth Waltz, the Cold War was stable, did not escalate to a hot war. This third factor is the nuclear revolution. The nuclear revolution, that is to say, the fact that the two superpowers possess a huge amount of nuclear weapons, and according to realists, at least such as Kenneth Waltz, nuclear weapons incite statesmen to behave prudently and to behave moderately. Nuclear weapons have a sobering effect on statesmen, because if ever they consider to go to war, even a conventional war, there is a risk of escalation into a nuclear war, and the nuclear war potentially is synonymous with the suicide of mankind. So the fact for the Soviet and the American statesmen to know that in the case of a nuclear war, they themselves might die, and the greater part of humanity might die, if mankind might be killed, incites them to be prudent. Therefore, the bipolar nuclear balance of Chara contributed to the overall stability. So Kenneth Waltz's analysis of the stability was very successful when it was published, and this success was due to both his capacity to propose an analysis which is impossible within the classical realist approach, given the offensive dimension of the classical realist approach. And it was successful within the realist camp, the realist school, the realist paradigm, because it permitted to explain the stability in terms different from the English school, given that realists, as I already mentioned, refuse to conceive of the possibility of a society. Only a system exists, and therefore it is the power political configuration which is important, rather than the kind of shared intention to establish and to maintain a dialogue. So Kenneth Waltz's neorealism was successful, and gradually it replaced the classical realism among the realists within the discipline of international relations. We can sum up the major differences between classical realism and neorealism as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, first, international politics. What explains that international politics basically is power politics, human nature, according to classical realists, anarchy, according to neorealists. What does the state concretely look for on the international scene? Power, according to classical realists, who therefore are offensive realists. Security, according to neorealists, who therefore are defensive realists. And how is stability possible, at least temporarily? Thanks to multipolarity, according to Morgenthau. Morgenthau was influenced by the 19th century multipolar structure, which, according to him, explained the so-called British peace, the so-called long 19th century stability. We saw in our chapter 2 that this stability was interrupted only temporarily by short wars, Crimean War, the wars of the Italian and the German unification. Kenneth Waltz's neorealist approach claims that bipolarity is stable and not multipolarity. Both classical realists such as Morgenthau and neorealists such as Waltz are a balance of power theorists. That is to say, they consider that stability is only possible when there is a balance, either between 2 or between 3, 4, 5, etc. They do not, to put it differently, conceive the possibility of a unipolar system with only one major power dominating all the other ones. This possibility will be taken into account, will be considered to be possible by Gilpin, Robert Gilpin, in another neo-realist version, which I already mentioned this, which I will have a look at in my chapter 11. So Waltz was very successful. His neo-realist approach was very successful. And of course, as usual, in a discipline characterized by plural approaches and therefore by contending debates, this success was rejected by non-realist scholars, eager to look for the limits, the flaws of Kenneth Waltz's neo-realist approach. And according to these non-realist scholars, the weak point, to some extent, of Kenneth Waltz was his self-help principle. That is to say, the fact that states cannot but rely upon themselves, cannot trust anybody else, because this ends up in saying that cooperation is impossible. And indeed, in Kenneth Waltz's analysis, cooperation basically is unconceivable. Since there is self-help, there can be no cooperation. This idea, Kenneth Waltz took it from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. and more specifically from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's stag hunt metaphor. You know, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he wrote first and foremost a major political philosophical essay and social contracts. He also wrote different fragments on the state of war, and one of his very first essays, which made him famous, was the discourse on the origin of inequality among men. And in this discourse, in this short essay, he described his conception of the state of nature among men before they created a society. So somehow similar to Hobbes or to Locke, but he has a different conception of the state of nature. You may know that, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, men living in the state of nature were, he called them, noble savages. This also was influenced by the description of noble savages overseas in the Western Hemisphere that the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, and the French discoverers, if you can use this term, brought to Europe. Anyway, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, noble savages live in peace during the state of nature. They live in peace because they have almost no contact with one another. Somehow the term savage excludes regular contacts. They live in isolation. I quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the noble savage satisfies his hunger at the first brook. He slakes his thirst at the first brook. He satisfies his hunger at the first oak. Sorry. He slakes his thirst at the first brook. He finds his bed at the foot of the tree which gave him his meal. And with this, all his wants were supplied. So very simple life. Sometimes, however, the noble savage was interested, or was tempted, or was encouraged to establish contacts with other savages who also were living in isolation. There were sometimes opportunities or occasions to associate with his fellow savages precisely when he needed their help to catch a big prey, to kill an animal, such as a stag or a deer, depends on the translation, in order to satisfy his hunger. And it is at this moment that emerged what Rousseau calls the stag hunter's dilemma, the dilemma of the primitive hunter. So imagine in the state of nature, primitive state of nature, 5, 6, 7 hunters, primitive hunters, noble savages, associating in order to trap a stag because they want to satisfy their hunger over a long period. So they decide to cooperate. And when they take this decision, of course, there is a coincidence between the private interest of each of the hunters and the common interests of all the hunters taken together. And the private interest, of course, is that each will eat his fill if they manage to kill a huge prey such as a stag. And there's a common interest in cooperating because one hunter alone is unlikely to catch and to kill such a stag. They must cooperate in order to launch a successful hunt. So there is a coincidence, and without this coincidence between the individual interest and the common interest, there would have been no cooperation. However, a dilemma sooner or later will emerge according to Rousseau. The dilemma will emerge when one of the hunters, posted somewhere in the forest, to try to catch the stag, when one of the hunters sees a rabbit coming within his reach. The dilemma emerges because the hunter will ask to himself the following question: should I grasp the rabbit, or should I go on hunting the stag? There is no more a coincidence between the individual interest and the common interest. The individual interest could consist in saying, I will catch the rabbit. In doing so, I will satisfy my hunger at least for 1 or 2 days. But in doing so, the stag will escape. And the common interest would consist in not taking or grasping or chasing the rabbit, but being loyal to the other hunters in order to make sure that together we will be able to catch the stag, thus satisfying all our different hungers during 2 or 3 weeks. So a dilemma emerges in the mind of the primitive hunter who sees the hare, the rabbit. What then will be the decision taken by the primitive hunter concerned? According to Rousseau, he will privilege his egoistic short-term interest, that is to say, he will catch the rabbit, and in doing so, the stag will be able to escape. Listen to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If a stag was to be taken, everyone saw that in order to succeed, he must abide faithfully to his post. But if a rabbit happens to come within the reach of any of the hunters, there is no doubt that this hunter pursued the rabbit without any scruple. And having seized this prey, he would care very little if by doing so he caused his companions to miss the stag. To put it differently, the dilemma, hunter's dilemma, according to Rousseau, was resolved egoistically. The hunter's egoism prevailed. Why then did, according to Rousseau, the primitive hunter privilege the rabbit, the hare, rather than the stag or the deer? Not because of his bad nature. By definition, remember, the savage is noble. So he's not bad, he's not evil. It is not because of his nature. It is because of the subjective uncertainty felt by the primitive hunter. The subjective uncertainty. He could not be sure that if he did not catch the hare, the other hunter would profit from this to catch the hare, in the case of the hare, the rabbit coming within reach of this second hunter. And why couldn't he know how the other one would act? Because of the absence of any authority telling all the hunters what to do and what not to do, and sanctioning, that is to say, punishing those who would not keep their promise to cooperate. So there was a risk, to put it differently, according to Rousseau, of the hunter being victim of other hunters cheating. So it was impossible for the different hunters individually taken to trust any other hunter taken individually. So if, according to Rousseau, primitive hunters, primitive men in the state of nature act egoistically or unilaterally or privilege the self-help principle, it is because of the anarchical structure. Nobody forces anybody to act this way rather than that way, or vice versa. And this then is the conclusion which will be shared by Kenneth Waltz, who will apply it to international politics. He will transfer Rousseau's metaphor of the state of nature among men to international politics. Listen to Kenneth Waltz. The story is simple. The implications are tremendous. In cooperative action, one cannot rely on others. The tension between one man's immediate interests, he refers to the stag hunt example, this tension between one man's immediate interest and the general interest of the group is resolved by the unilateral action of one man privileging his specific private interests, even the short-term rather than the long-term interest. Why? Because reason, look at the slide, look at the quote, tells him that if he forgoes the hare, the man next to him will profit to chase the rabbit or the hare. And the first then will come to the conclusion, wow, I was foolish to be loyal because I am victim of the other hunter or the other state cheating. States cannot trust other states because if they cooperate faithfully, they may be the victims of other states cheating. The foolishness, the folly of being loyal perfectly summarizes Kenneth Waltz's conception of anarchy, of cooperation, and should I say, the impossibility of cooperation in anarchy, because of anarchy. This radical stance of Kenneth Waltz is problematic if we look at the reality of international politics. States do cooperate, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, they do cooperate bilaterally. This was the case of the US and the USSR when he wrote his book. And today, all the more so, cooperate multilaterally in international organizations, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreements on Terrorism Trade, which became the World Trade Organization. In the domain today of international environment, this was not the case in the past, but it's the case now. The states do cooperate every day, bilaterally, multilaterally. Waltz, being that radical in his emphasizing the irrationality of cooperation, cannot account for this reality. And this then will be the point where his theory will be attacked by neoliberals, neoliberal institutionalists, and first and foremost, Robert Keohane in his After Hegemony, published in 1984. We saw Keohane in chapter 6 when he published his two books belonging to the transnationalist approach. I said that he abandoned this transnationalist approach to launch the so-called neoliberal approach, or the neoliberal institutionalist approach, which then was criticized by other neorealists and Kenneth Waltz, Joseph Grieco, notably. This then will be the so-called neo debate of the 1980s in the domain of cooperation. So let's have a look at Keohane's neoliberal conception of cooperation. In order to prove that cooperation is possible and that it is rational and that it really exists and that it continues once it starts, etc., Robert Keohane resorts not to the stag hunt metaphor, but to another dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma. So he also uses game theory, but he uses the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma, ladies and gentlemen, is describes the situation of two criminals, two individuals accused of having committed a crime and who are jailed separately in two different cells because of the crime they are accused of having committed. And in this metaphor, the district attorney calls them into his office to propose them a kind of to make them a proposal to both of them separately, one after the other, prisoner A, prisoner B. So the district attorney first says to prisoner A, if tomorrow you admit having committed the crime you are accused of having committed, if you confess your guilt, and if your body does not confess his guilt, I can set you free because I will be able to put your body into the jail for 20 long years. And of course, he makes the same proposal to the second prisoner, prisoner B. The two prisoners ask, however, two questions separately once again. A and B first ask the district attorney, what happens if we do not confess, if we do not agree in saying that we committed the crime? Well, the response of the district attorney is the following one. In this case, given the poor evidence I have of your guilt, you will be sentenced to only 1 year of prison. Okay, and second question asked by the two prisoners, and what if both we confess our crime? Well, if you confess your crime, you will be jailed for merely 5 years and not 20 years, because to some extent you admitted your guilt, and therefore the sentence will be not that hard. So after having received these proposals, the two prisoners go back to their separate cells. This is important. They have the full night to think about what to do when they will once again be called into the office of the district attorney. So what do? They think of the best strategy to adopt. Of course, for prisoner A, the best hypothesis, the best scenario would consist in he confesses, the other one refuses to admit, because the other one will then be put into jail and he himself will be set free. The same thing is true, vice versa, for prisoner B. The second best scenario is to be sentenced to 1 year prison in the case of none of them confessing their crime. And the second worst scenario is 5 years in prison if both confess their crime. And of course, for prisoner B, the opposite is true. So 4 possibilities for each of them. And of course, the most rational decision, ladies and gentlemen, the most rational decision for A consists in confessing having committed the crime. Because at least he is sure by doing so that he will not be sentenced to 20 years prison. So this is true for A, but it's also true for B. Because both are afraid that the other one will not confess. So both will end up confessing, and they will be sentenced to 5 years prison. Problem, however, according to Keohane, is that in doing so, they, of course, avoid the 20 years prison, but they do not obtain the best possible solution, which would have been consisting in 1 only year of imprisonment in the case they both had refused to confess. So there is a kind of opposition or divergence between the individual rationality, I confess in order to be sure not to be jailed during 20 long years, and the collective rationality, which would have consisted in non-confessing the crime, because if both had refused to recognize being guilty, they would have been sentenced to only 1 year. So 1 year is better than 5 years, of course. The question then asked by Keohane is the following: why didn't the two prisoners refuse to admit their guilt? Well, the answer is the following one: because they were in separate cells. They could not trust the other one because they could not talk to the other one. They could not come to an agreement. You refuse to confess your guilt, I refuse to confess my guilt, and both then we will be jailed for only 1 year. There was no contact, no communication, because they were jailed in separate cells. The solution then, or the conclusion then of Kieran is the following one. If it had been possible for the two prisoners to establish a dialogue, to establish a communication, then they could have foreseen what the other one would do. And thus they could have come to an agreement. No one of us admits his guilt. We both then will be sentenced to only 1 year, which is better than 5 years if both confess. So the collective solution is superior to the individually rational solution. To act unilaterally, in this case to avoid 20 years, is only the second best solution. States, however, would have an interest in looking for the best, collectively speaking, solution. How then can this be possible? It can be possible if there is information about what the other one will do. If the uncertainty, which Rousseau emphasized, of what the other one will do no longer exists. How then is it possible to overcome this subjective uncertainty of other states' action? Well, thanks precisely to international organizations. When states establish international organizations, when they sign international treaties, they commit themselves to do this or that, everything that is listed in the charter of the organizations, in the text of the treaties. They commit themselves to do this, not to do that. All the states promise to do so. All the states, therefore, somehow can know what the other ones will do. If then they can know what the other ones will do, they can themselves act with confidence because the other one promised to do this and the first one promised to do this too. Both commit themselves to respect the rules. It is possible to predict other states' behavior. And if this is possible, then cooperation is rewarding because it will permit the best solution rather than the second best, collectively speaking. All the states, be they two in the case of bilateral cooperation or more than two in the case of multilateral cooperation, profit from the cooperation. Cooperation is a positive gain for all the states cooperating. And therefore, in order to do so, in order to favor cooperation, they establish international organizations, international law, international regimes, thanks to which they can foresee what the other one will do. That is to say, they are no longer afraid of the other one's cheating. If you know that the other one will behave according to his promises, you yourself can keep your promises. Both will profit from this cooperation. Therefore, cooperation exists, and therefore it goes on once it started because all the states profit from it. And thanks to this neoliberal institutional analysis of cooperation, Robert Keohane could explain what happened in the 1970s or after the 1970s, when, we saw this in chapter 6, Richard Nixon decided to put an end to Bretton Woods, the Bretton Woods regime of international financial and monetary relations established after World War II came to an end in 1971. What happened after this decision? Well, the Western major economies first and more developed economies a bit later replaced this Bretton Woods system by the G5, which became the G7, which became the G20 summits. All the states have an interest in cooperating, in this case, in the domain of financial international relations. And therefore, when a regime comes to an end, another one is invented. Regularly, today's major statesmen do meet in order to make sure that they go on respecting the international rules, the international principles, in our case here, in the domain of international financial relations. So, according to Keohane, this proves that the neoliberal explanation of cooperation is superior to Kenneth Waltz's grand theory, grand neorealist theory. Problem, however, once again, of Keohane is that we can ask the question, why did Nixon decide to put an end to the Bretton Woods system, which had worked successfully roughly during 25 years or so? If Nixon took this decision, doesn't this tend to prove that cooperation may come to an end, though it may be positive? How then can we explain, if it is positive, that some states, in our case here, Nixon's America, decide to no longer cooperate on the basis of existing principles? Well, this question will be asked by neorealists, not Waltz himself, but notably Joseph Grieco, who committed himself in the neo-neo debate in order to criticize Robert Keohane. And Joseph Grieco proposed the following analysis. Neoliberal institutionalists such as Keohane are wrong when they believe that anarchy, the absence of a central authority, means the absence of information. Keohane thought that the fact for no central authority to exist did not prevent states from establishing international organizations in order to permit precisely this information, in order to know what states would do, in order to permit all the states to know what all the other states would do, how they would act in the future, etc., etc. No, according to Joseph Grieco, anarchy does not mean the absence, does not entail first and foremost the absence of information. It entails first and foremost the absence of security. It comes back to Waltz to some extent. States must look for their security. What does that mean in the domain of cooperation? This means that since they have to look for their security, they have to look whether the cooperation with other states profits more to them or more to the partners in the cooperation. That is to say, ladies and gentlemen, according to Joseph Grieco, a cooperation is not a positive game where all the players, the states, profit. No, it is a zero-sum game. One state is likely to benefit more from the cooperation than the other one. That is to say, three scenarios are possible. In a cooperation, a state either wins or loses or draws. No one loses, no one wins. But it is impossible for Grieco that both states win, because one of them will win at least a bit more, which means that the other one will lose relatively. Your security can only be achieved thanks to your resources. A state guarantees its security thanks to an amount of resources, at least balanced, at least as important as the other states' military resources. So when a state commits itself in a cooperation, it must make sure that this cooperation will not profit the other state. If the absolute gains of the other states are superior to the first state's absolute gains, then the first state has relative losses, because the other one has superior absolute gains, that is, relative gains. In this case, according to Grieco, cooperation will be very, very difficult. A state will not engage in cooperation because it would be irrational to engage oneself in a cooperation permitting the other state to win more. Cooperation is not a win-win. interaction, according to neorealists such as Greco. One state wins more than the other one. This risk states cannot afford to take because their security will, on the long run, be endangered. Cooperation is only possible when the state either wins or when it draws. When it expects to lose, the cooperation will not start, or it will come to an end in the case it already existed. So for neorealists, a bit less radical than Kenneth Waltz, cooperation is possible, but it is harder to achieve, and it is likely to last over shorter periods than according to liberals, neoliberals, who are very optimistic regarding the long-term positive impact of cooperation for all the states. The neo-neo debate, ladies and gentlemen, opposing notably Kilhane to Grieco, resulted in a kind of a synthesis, so-called neo-neo synthesis, that is to say, compromise. At the end of the debates, the neoliberals on the one hand and neorealists on the other hand agreed in saying, well, we both are a bit right, and we both are sometimes wrong to some extent. A kind of compromise. So this compromise consists in saying that the liberals, the neoliberals, are right when saying that cooperation is possible and actually easy to achieve and likely to endure in the economic domain, because it profits the welfare of all the states. Absolute gains, even lesser absolute gains, are nevertheless positive gains for all the states. And their population, of course, will profit from them in terms of welfare. And they agreed also in saying that realists or neorealists somehow were right when saying that cooperation is more difficult or likely to come to an end in the domain of security. Because in the domain of security, when your resources end up becoming lower than the other ones, your security is no longer guaranteed, because the other one gradually becomes more and more powerful. So it would be foolish to go on cooperating. Then it is rational to adopt a self-help unilateral policy, as put forward by Waltz. So this compromise somehow is convincing, sounds convincing, at least at first sight. We already saw that the major states, first major Western states, and a bit later the major economies in general, established the G5, the G7, the G20 summit to find a kind of new informal cooperation, replacing the abandoned Bretton Woods regime. What's more, in the 1990s, the US welcomed China as a new member of the World Trade Organization. To some extent, this proves that neoliberals were right. The fact for China to become an important trading partner will profit everybody. We in the West buy cheaper products, cheaper goods produced by the Chinese. It would be foolish not to profit for our consumers, for our consumers' welfare in the West. It would be foolish not to profit from China. Therefore, we welcome China as a member of the World Trade Organization. But maybe you know what happened 2 or 3 or 4 years ago. Donald Trump, what did he do? He decided to launch his trade war against China. Why? What? Because he, rightly or wrong, he perceived that China was more profiting from its trade with the US than the US itself. American workers lost their job, etc., etc. So what did he do? He adopted a protectionist policy. That is to say, he abandoned cooperation, or at least he no longer accepted to cooperate on the basis of the same principles that had been prevailing when China was accepted as a full member of the World Trade Organization. To put it differently, ladies and gentlemen, he acted on the basis of the realist perception of economic cooperation being a zero-sum game. If China wins more than us Americans, we lose. And if we lose economically speaking, sooner or later, this will have an impact upon our security. Why? Because our military resources somehow depend on a strong economic basis. So the more we lose economically, the more we are likely to endanger on the long run our security, because the more China will profit economically, the more it will be able in the future to build a powerful military force which might threaten us. So Trump, to some extent, acted like a realist statesman, or he acted, when he acted, he corroborated the more pessimistic analysis of cooperation proposed by the neo-realists. Ladies and gentlemen, which conclusion may I, if I may, do draw? Well, I do think that states most of the time cooperate, but when it comes to unequal gains, cooperation is only possible when there is a kind of hegemonic power which takes the responsibility of permitting the regime to work more or less efficiently. And we will see this idea of cooperation possible thanks to the presence of a hegemonic power in precisely Robert Gilpin's unipolar neo-realist approach in our chapter 11, because, as I already mentioned, it will permit us to understand the contemporary rivalry between the US and China. We will do this in our chapter 11. Thank you so much for attending today's class. Hope you be back next week. Have a great day. Goodbye.